Hello, and welcome to Dark Hearts with Stacey Lee. Before we begin, please hit the like button if you like the video, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more from me, and you can always join my Patreon. We have a big fundraising goal there, and I will talk about that at the end of the video. Whenever I hear someone say, all those people are this or all those people are that, I have to chuckle. Statements like that tell me a lot about a person. People who make general, sweeping statements like that really expose themselves to be ignorant. As a 53-year-old woman who spends the majority of my time researching human behavior, I can say one thing with all confidence. There are bad people in every group, in every sector, in every income class, in every race, in every identity, and in every culture in the world. The bad people just get the press. The bad people are the ones we hear about. In fact, that's a common criticism of those in the true crime world. We're giving more press to people that do bad things. And we are. That's why on this channel, we try and focus on why people do what they do. Because in talking about this type of behavior, we are more likely to get to the root cause of it. Today, I have a story about a very rare type of killer. A killer from a culture that has very little crime, almost none in comparison with the rest of society. But as is often the case, criminals that come from the most strict and restrictive cultures are often the worst of the worst. And that is the case in our story today. To this day, we don't know how many lives were lost at the hands of this strange and dangerous man. This is a horrifying story about acts committed by a true monster. This is the story of Eli Stutzman, the Amish serial killer. I'm your host, Stacey Lee. Let's begin. Our story begins in Hebron, Nebraska. A man named Chuck Cleveland wants a haircut before the Christmas holiday, so he leaves his rural home in Chester to drive about 10 miles into Hebron. His wife stays at home. About an hour after Chuck leaves the house, he rushes back into his home. His hair has not been cut, and Chuck is out of breath and in a panic. He brushed right by his wife Kathy and went straight to his son David's bedroom. His wife followed him, concerned and confused as to what was going on. Once Chuck saw that his son David was alive and well in his room, he turned to Kathy and said, "I just found a dead little boy." Kathy was shocked. Chuck pulled her away from David's room and told her he was driving about a mile outside of Chester, looking out in the snowy white fields, when a touch of color caught his eye. It looked out of place to him, and so Chuck pulled over. He walked towards what he could then see was a blue blanket, and he peered down into the ditch running near the side of the road. It was a boy wrapped in the blue blanket. The boy was frozen, and it was difficult to see his facial features, but he had blonde hair. So did Chuck's son. That's why he was concerned. He ran back to his truck and used his CB radio to call the truck stop he owned. His receptionist took the call, and he told her to send the sheriff. Police arrived within minutes and began an investigation. The boy was thin, maybe 55 pounds, and he was almost 5 feet tall. He had been strangled, and there were marks on his neck. For some reason, the pathologist wasn't as confident as the police, and he ruled the cause of death inconclusive. He wasn't so sure the boy had been strangled. The police were sure this was a murder. The doctors were not. But everyone wondered, murdered or not, who would dump a boy on the side of the road like this? No one in Chester had reported a missing child, so this was very disturbing. A very sad Christmas day passed, then a week passed, and then a month. No one came forward to identify the boy. The citizens and the media began calling him Little Boy Blue because he was found wrapped in a blue blanket. And then the townspeople paid for a headstone and a funeral, and the boy was buried. No one involved had any way of knowing who had taken this boy's life or why, and they had no idea that he was the victim of a serial killer. Eli Stutzman was born on September 30th, 1950. He grew up in a very strict sect of the Amish community in Apple Creek, Ohio. He lived in the largest Amish settlement in the country, known as the Swartzentruber order. These Amish are old order Amish. They are the most secretive and the most zealous of all the Amish people. In fact, the Swartzentruber order broke away from the mainstream Amish community because the Amish community was not conservative enough for these people. The Swartzentruber Amish do not have running water. They don't even use buttons on their clothing because buttons are too decorative and ostentatious. They actually pin their clothes together. Eli's formative years are not well documented. We don't have details about his childhood or his teen years, as the Amish community is very secretive and they don't send their kids to public schools. We do know a little bit of information from Amish people willing to give information. They remember Eli as a very quiet and withdrawn man, but also a man who did not always tell the truth. In fact, I saw some reports that said he was known to be a prolific liar. Eli spent his youth with the Swartzentruber order, and in the mid-1970s, he married a woman in the order named Ida. Together, they had a son named Daniel, who was born in 1976. Ida quickly became pregnant again just months after Daniel's birth, and it was then that tragedy struck. In July of 1977, 26-year-old Ida Stutzman woke to the terrifying sound of fire just outside her bedroom window. It was just after midnight as Ida sat up in bed and then woke her husband Eli to tell him something was wrong. Eli and Ida went to the bedroom window and could see that their barn was on fire. According to Eli, he and Ida raced outside to fight the fire. He later told leaders in the Amish community, as well as the police, that Ida, risking her own life and the life of her unborn child, ran into the barn to remove the family's milking equipment from the barn in order to save it. Eli claims that Ida somehow got trapped as she ran in and out of the milk house by the barn, and that he had to go in after her, dragging her by the feet from the burning building. As other members of the Amish community raced to the Stutzman property to help fight the fire, they found Ida dead outside the barn. Now, in these secret societies, the law does not usually work the way it does for the rest of us. Eli Stutzman had a relationship of some kind with the Amish sheriff, and so Ida's death, unbelievably, was ruled an accident due to either smoke inhalation or a heart attack. There was no investigation done into her death at all. The coroner took Eli's word that his wife had a bad heart, and so no autopsy was performed. Well, this was news to Ida's family. They had never known Ida to have a weak heart. They had never been told that Ida was having any health problems at all. But Eli insisted that in the months leading up to the fire, Ida had been complaining of chest pains and shortness of breath. Ida's family wanted answers as to why Ida's face was bruised and the side of her head looked as though it had been struck. But even with all of these questions and the obvious issues surrounding the incident, the death remained ruled an accident. Later on, it would be revealed that Ida Stutzman had found out some very upsetting information about her husband Eli, something entirely forbidden in the Amish community, and it changed everything for the family. Eli Stutzman was gay. We don't have details about how or when Ida discovered this about her husband, but it is now believed that at some point after the birth of their son, Ida saw something or read something that let her know her husband was hiding who he was. Hiding it because obviously he had to. He didn't have a choice. The Amish are homophobic and very close-minded when it comes to homosexuality, not understanding that it is not a choice, it is simply the way someone is born. 10% or more of us. Eli was living a secret life because he had to. But Eli did not have to do the things he went on to do after his wife's death. Within a year of Ida's death, Eli Stutzman completely changed. First, he isolated himself and Danny, even away from other Amish in the community. Then he appeared in public with his beard shaved, which, if you know anything about the Amish, is something you do not do. The men do not shave their beards. Then whispers began to float through the area that Eli had, as the Amish say, gone English. He had electricity installed in his house, and he even put up a TV antenna on the roof. Now, if you remember earlier, I said that people remembered Eli as quiet and withdrawn, but also as someone who was dishonest and often told lies. So the fact that Eli had gone English was not all that shocking to those in the community. He had never been a man of high repute, and the fact that he had fallen away from the Amish community was not a surprise to anyone. Eli even started drinking alcohol, which is something the Amish forbid. Then he did something that, at the time, wasn't even completely accepted in modern society. He came out as gay. Eli stopped hiding his sexuality. He had magazines laying around the house, magazines made for the gay community, and everyone knew that Eli was having sexual relationships with men. As shocking as this was, it was about to get much, much worse. Eli Stutzman packs up his house, he takes a few belongings with him, and he loads his son Danny into the car and leaves the Amish community behind forever. Eli has made the decision to leave all that he has ever known and start living, as the Amish call it, an English lifestyle. Eli put his farm up for sale and sold it. He took the money along with Danny and they headed to Colorado. Eli told people that he was not going to allow his son to be raised in the Amish community. He actually said, "I'm not going to let them do to him what they did to me." And that we can somewhat understand, right? We can understand why a father would go to such great lengths to protect his son from being raised in a very restrictive, shame and guilt-based culture. But Eli Stutzman was not such a magnanimous father with good intentions. Yes, he wanted to get away from the Amish, and yes, he truly felt he did not want his son raised Amish, but he also had other designs. Eli began placing ads in gay magazines to meet men. Remember, this is 1982. There was no internet to meet people online, and the gay dating scene was very much underground. Eli would post photos of himself shirtless, and he was in very good physical condition, and he would use the heading, "Well-Built Horseman." Ooh la la! He advertised that he was looking for men to have encounters with, and he gave some other specifics as well. Once in Colorado, Eli's life, once so restricted and so controlled, spiraled into chaos. He began drinking quite heavily. He and Danny had a small apartment in Colorado. Apparently, Eli picked Colorado because he heard there was a lively gay scene there, and he liked that the men would be outdoorsy, more the rugged type, which was the way he viewed himself. Very quickly, Eli was engaged in dangerous behavior. He was attending parties and bars where there was a lot of alcohol involved, there were drugs involved, and there was a lot of casual sex. Still, even at this point in the story, we can feel for Eli. He's been denied all of the pleasures of his life, his entire life, and now he is free to live as he chooses. We can see how he wanted to experience all of the things denied to him for so long. But we have to remember, this is the father to a young boy who has been literally uprooted and torn away from everything he has ever known, a young boy who has lost his mother in a tragic fire, and a young boy who must have been very lost and confused and most definitely neglected. On November 10th, 1985, in Durango, Colorado, someone riding on the Silverton Narrow Gauge Railroad saw something very disturbing. In the bed of an abandoned truck lay the decaying body of a man. The truck was parked along the 1400 block of Main Avenue. The police were called and confirmed that yes, there was a body in that truck, and the man had been murdered, dying from a severe head injury inflicted with something heavy. Police took fingerprints and identified the man as 36-year-old David M. Tyler. He was the co-owner of a business the truck was parked at. The business was called Automatic Transmission Exchange. The police investigated this murder for months, but it remained unsolved. Then, on December 5th, 1985, 24-year-old Dennis Slater was found shot to death in the basement at Junction Creek Liquors, where he worked as a store clerk. For a second time, Colorado police were called to the scene, and they identified the victim, began an investigation, and started looking into the murder. Just like in David's murder, the investigation was not solved. It went cold for quite some time. The police did learn some things about their victims. David Tyler was a gay man who did use drugs on occasion. Then the police learned that David Tyler and Dennis Slater knew each other. But that wasn't the best clue, as the area was quite small and quite rural, and a lot of people knew each other. David Tyler had lived in Durango for years. He and two other men owned the auto shop where David worked as a mechanic. He had never married, and he didn't have any family in the area. People knew David as a really friendly guy and a great mechanic, and they also knew that he was gay. Being openly gay, David had actually received death threats by phone from an area bigot, I don't know, and those threats scared him enough to start carrying a gun. David liked to have drinks 1 or 2 nights a week, and when he did, he usually had them at the Diamond Bell Saloon. The last time anyone saw David was Saturday, November 9th, at the local Holiday Inn. Dennis Slater was a different story. Dennis was just weeks away from earning a degree in psychology from Fort Lewis College. He was working at Junction Creek Liquors a few nights a week while he'd attended college, and he'd been doing so for about 6 months. Dennis was an outdoorsy guy. He loved playing football and going skiing, and he loved being in the mountains. He was very tall and athletic, and more than one person described him as a gentle giant. Police came to the conclusion that perhaps a transient had come through their town and robbed the liquor store, shooting and killing Dennis in the process. It's really common, especially in these older stories, for the police to immediately blame a transient or an out-of-towner for these crimes that they cannot solve. More often than not, they're wrong. More often than not, the killer turns out to be one of their own. Eli Stutzman was never a suspect around the time of these two murders. The police had no reason to suspect him, and they never questioned him or connected him to the killings. But all of that changed just 2 years later. Reader's Digest ran an article about Little Boy Blue, found 2 years earlier back in Nebraska. When I was a kid, Reader's Digest was a big deal. It was where you got all kinds of information about the world. You got your local and state news from your local and state newspapers, and you got a brief glance at nationwide news on the nightly news. But special interest stories that you now see all over the internet weren't as available as they are now. Those are the kinds of stories that were published in Reader's Digest. I wish I had a photo of this to share with you, but my grandfather collected Reader's Digests and had an entire bookcase full of them in his basement. They were all very neatly cataloged chronologically, and I believe he had every issue for several decades. Sadly, I think that collection was tossed when he and my grandmother passed, which I think is a shame. But yes, everyone read Reader's Digest. The story of the boy found on Christmas Eve, wrapped in a blue blanket, appeared in this edition of Reader's Digest. When I say everyone read Reader's Digest, I mean pretty much everyone, even the Amish. An Amish woman back in Ohio read the story of Little Boy Blue. This woman had once babysat Danny when he was younger. She saw the sketches of the boy, and she read about the blue pajamas the boy was wearing when he was found. This woman had a very strong feeling she knew who the boy was, and she contacted the authorities. Slowly, police began to piece together what had happened, not only to Little Boy Blue, but to others who had crossed paths with Eli Stutzman. The police sat down with members of the Amish community, and for several days, they interviewed people who knew Eli, and they also interviewed Ida's family members. They learned that Eli had picked up and moved to Colorado, taking his son with him. They then tracked Eli and Danny to Austin, Texas, and learned that the two of them had lived there for about a year. So we've got poor Danny just being dragged around by this man who saw him as more of a nuisance than anything. He never had any stability, never a steady school to attend, and probably suffering from very little love and affection. It's really very sad. His little short life was not great. As cops investigated, they heard a name they hadn't heard before tied to Eli Stutzman, and the name was Glenn Pritchett. Glenn Albert Pritchett was a 24-year-old man who had lived with Eli and Danny in Austin. He was Eli's roommate. Now, whether they were romantically involved or not, who knows? We do know that Glenn was divorced. He had 2 young children, and then he moved in with Danny and Eli. The guy was probably just looking for a roommate in order to save on rent. Sadly, he chose the wrong roommate. Glenn Pritchett was murdered sometime in May of 1985. We do not know the exact date, but his body was found on May 12th in a ditch by a field, an area almost identical to where Danny Stutzman had been left. Because yes, as I'm sure you figured out, Danny Stutzman is Little Boy Blue. Glenn had served in the U.S. Coast Guard, and so his fingerprints were on file, and that's how cops identified him. The police went to Eli's apartment where Glenn had been living, and they tell Eli that they need to speak with him. Eli tells the cops that yes, he knows Glenn, and yes, they are roommates. The police then tell Eli that Glenn has been found murdered. The police describe Eli as nervous, and he tells them that he actually hasn't seen Glenn for several months. Eli tells them that Glenn was going to head home to see his family back in Montana, and he tells them that he even gave Glenn a ride to the bus station to start his trip. The police notice that Eli has a bunch of photos of horses around in his apartment, and they ask if they're his. Eli tells them that yes, he does keep a horse at a farm, and that farm is about a mile away from where Glenn's body was found. So the police are very suspicious of Eli, and several of the cops are convinced he is Glenn's killer, but they simply don't have enough evidence at the time to arrest him, and they had to turn around and walk out of Eli's apartment, leaving him and Danny behind. Now, I could not find any information on what led the Nebraska police to be communicating with the Texas police. They were both speaking about Eli, and the Nebraska police were handling Danny's death. The Texas police were handling Glenn's death. So the Texas police then informed the Nebraska police that this guy, Eli's roommate, has just been found murdered. And that is what really gets the ball rolling on the investigation. Police become convinced that Eli Stutzman is a killer. But by the time they feel they have enough information to bring him in for questioning, Eli has taken Danny and disappeared. They had no idea as to where to look for him, and for 2 years, no one has any idea where Eli and Danny are at all. All along through this whole saga, the Amish back in Ohio have been getting letters from Danny. They're getting these letters from Danny that they're assuming Eli is mailing. But the letters were not from Danny. They were written in a child's hand by Eli in order to make it look like Danny was writing them, like Danny was still alive. It's just about as diabolical and evil as it gets. So Eli took Danny from the Amish community to Colorado. From Colorado, they went to Austin, Texas. They fled Austin, Texas, and that is when Eli drove back up to the town and the area that he was from and ended up dumping Danny in Nebraska. It's during that 2-year period of time that they completely lose track of Eli and of Danny. But all through that 2-year period, family members back in Amish country are getting letters from Danny, but they're being written by Eli. Eli even made a phone call to some family members, making himself sound like a little boy, pretending to be Danny. All along, Danny was dead. This is a sick, sick guy. Then Eli's parents get a letter. The letter is from Eli, and it informs his mother and father that their grandson, Danny, has died in an accident. Well, at this point, Danny has been dead for quite some time, and Eli has been impersonating him through letters and phone calls. But he finally fesses up and makes up this story that his son has died in an accident and tells his parents that. That's going to be his excuse as to why he's not with his son. Eli is setting himself up for when the cops come and talk to him about the murder of Glenn. He knows they're going to find him again. The police track Eli through these letters, and they get an anonymous tip that Eli is now using the name David Summers. The anonymous caller tells the cops that Eli is driving a light blue truck. Police find the truck, and then they track Eli to his trailer home. They surround the trailer and order Eli out of his house. Finally, they have him. Eli emerges from the trailer and is arrested where he stands. He is taken into custody for the murder of his son, Danny, and he is then extradited to Nebraska to stand trial. Eli told Thayer County Judge J. Patrick McCardle that his son died accidentally while sleeping in the back seat of the car as the two traveled from Wyoming to Ohio. Eli said the boy just died, must have been natural causes. Yeah, right. And so what did he do? Dumped him on the side of the road. Didn't take his boy to the hospital, the police, or even a funeral home. He dumped him on the side of the road. Eli told the court, "I decided to leave him and let God take care of him." Wow. Eli then went on to say that he spent several hours on the roadside with Danny's body and that he prayed for him. He said, "I had difficulty facing the fact that he had died. I couldn't understand. I couldn't figure out why." Because you strangled him, Eli. Unfortunately, prosecutors never get to a point where they can charge Eli with murder for Danny's murder. The evidence is simply not there. Eli is standing firm by his story that Danny just died in the car. And so all the police can do is charge Eli with improper disposal of a body and failure to report a death. In 1988, at 37 years old, Eli is sentenced to 18 months in prison for those crimes. Police went on record saying that they were convinced Eli had killed his son because he was just a burden. Danny didn't fit in with Eli's lifestyle and he wanted to be free of him. Police back in Ohio said they no longer believed Ida's death was an accident and that Eli had killed her because, 1, she discovered that he was gay, and 2, she was pregnant and Eli just didn't want another child. Eli Stutzman was sent off to prison in Nevada where he served his time and was then released. The police continue to investigate the deaths of Glenn, David, and Dennis. One of the working theories on Danny's murder then becomes that Danny may have been witness to Glenn's murder. Perhaps Eli and Glenn had a fight and Danny witnessed it. The cops even had testimony from a neighbor saying they heard a very serious argument between Eli and Glenn, and after that, they didn't see Glenn anymore. So I think this is a really plausible theory. Ugh, and Danny, this poor kid, I just can't even imagine what he endured in his short, sad life with this terrible man. It's just tragic. As soon as Eli is released in August of 1989, the state of Texas arrests him for the murder of Glenn Pritchett. They finally feel like they can put a case together. So Eli stands trial and is found guilty. He is then sentenced to 40 years in prison. Eli is locked up again and does his time for 16 years. I believe this is about the time we were having all the overcrowding in Texas. So in 2005, Eli is let go on early release and he is set up on parole. 16 years for a murder here in the States is not very much time. Eli moves to Fort Worth, Texas, and he flies under the radar for 2 years. He lived in a small one-bedroom apartment at the Courtyard on Calmont Apartments. He made and sold leather goods, which is a skill that he picked up in prison, and he also became addicted to crack cocaine at the time. Eli told people in the area that he'd done time in prison for drugs, not murder. His track record of lying continued. He also told people that he would go and visit his son in Amish country who had forgiven him for leaving the family. His son was dead. It was just another lie to make himself look better than he was. Just, acting like he's this concerned father when really he's the murderer of his son. Truly a psychopath. In January of 2007, Eli's rent check bounced. He told people around him that he was having a hard time making money. The truth is, Eli was spending everything he had on drugs. He gave his friend Charles his movie collection and a model ship that he'd built in prison, telling him that he was getting ready to move. That wasn't, in fact, what Eli Stutzman was getting ready to do. In February of 2007, for reasons known only to Eli, he took his own life. He was found on January 31st by a friend. He had drugs in his system, and his friends claim they believe he was murdered, that he was really planning on moving, and that someone had killed him in a drug deal perhaps. Later on, after these same friends Googled Eli and found out some of the things he had done, they changed their minds. They said maybe he'd finally developed a conscience. I personally don't believe that. I don't think it's possible for these cold-blooded reptilian creatures to develop a conscience. I think Eli was tired. I think he was broke. I think he was tired, and he was selfish. And once the reality of his situation hit him, he took himself out. He was 56 years old. He had no money. He was hooked on drugs. He had no family, and he was just tired. Eli Stutzman never stood trial for the murder of his wife, for David, or for Dennis, the murders that the cops suspected him of committing. There will never be justice for any of those people. The officers who worked this case, both in Nebraska and Texas, believe that Eli Stutzman was a serial killer. They are convinced that he killed 5 people along with Ida's unborn child. Some of them are convinced he most likely killed more. It doesn't matter how you grow up, what lifestyle you live, your orientation, how free or how restricted your upbringing is, or what your religious beliefs are. Some people are just born bad, and I think it's safe to say we can count Eli Stutzman among those who are. Thank you for joining me today on Dark Hearts with Stacey Lee. Please hit the like button if you liked the video, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more from me. It helps so much. And you can even join my Patreon. We have a big goal there, and it's this. We would like to raise money to donate to police departments that have cold case DNA in storage that has never been tested because there's no money. There are thousands of sexual assault kits sitting in refrigeration that have never been tested. They cost between $500 and $750 each. This community is committed to raising the funds to get some of those kits tested. The byproduct of getting that kit tested is that we get that perpetrator's DNA in the system forever. And if they've committed other crimes, it might help solve those as well. Stay tuned for some special episodes coming up about the fundraising. I sure appreciate you guys. I've gotten really good feedback on the rebrand of the channel, formerly Dining with Death, now Dark Hearts with Stacey Lee. I think you guys are enjoying the episodes, and that just makes my heart so happy. I know you have so many options of things to watch, so the fact that you stop by my channel and watch my episodes means the world to me. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other, and I will see you next time on Dark Hearts with Stacey Lee. Bye.